The shadow demon rejoined Ludmilla as she stepped out of the bushes that encircled the open village and onto the manor lane. Campbell's manor was several hundred meters up the hillside, and two large men could be seen stationed at the entrance of the grounds. Though late in the afternoon, the skies were still quite bright. She wondered how well the shadow demons would be able to work in these conditions. Deciding on an approach that followed the side of the road, she walked along the poorly maintained snarl that was probably once an ornamental hedge. As she came closer, she noted that the two sentries were not a part of the same group of hirelings that Campbell Fassett had surrounded himself with in his hall. They seemed to be nothing more than a pair of large men that did not give off the air of experienced combatants. Their broad stature, however, probably did much to dissuade the nearby villagers and prospective troublemakers from drawing near. Ludmilla stopped at the base of the slope and silently stared up at them from the middle of the road. It did not take long for them to notice the suspicious, masked figure below. When she did not leave after several minutes, they exchanged glances and made their way down the dirt road. Ludmilla wondered what to do as they approached. Mercenaries who willingly exchanged their lives for coin were one thing, but, from the account of the children that they had brought into the camp, even common laborers were being offered work as the lines were drawn between Jacqueline and Campbell. With the domain falling further into poverty as the standoff bled away the wealth of the land and its people, more and more men were being drawn in as desperation drove them into taking any job for food. "You shouldn't be standing around here, girl," one of the men warned her as he came within speaking distance. "This is the Lord's manor." She simply continued staring at them, so they came closer. "Something wrong with you, girl?" the man said. "What's with that get-up, anyways?" "You should leave this place," Ludmilla said quietly. "What's that?" He stepped forward to better hear her voice. "I said you should return to your families," she replied. "Now look here." Ludmilla stepped forward and grabbed his improvised billhook. It came away from his hands with little resistance and they all stared at one another for a moment. She had not expected for the man to be holding his weapon so loosely, and the moves which she had plotted in advance were suddenly no longer required. The man came forward in a delayed reaction to snatch back his stolen weapon and she pivoted aside, bringing the base of the polearm into the side of the man's jaw. Reversing her strike, she continued past his collapsing form to jam her weapon against the second man's own, pushing the point offline and into the ground. Guiding the weapon with her right hand felt a bit awkward, but the impromptu form allowed her to snap her foot into the side of the man's left leg. He staggered as his knee buckled under him, and Ludmilla flicked his bound spear away with her own as he flailed his arms to maintain his crumbling stance. He fell heavily on the ground and, when he rose to stand again, froze when he found the point of her polearm a hand's breadth away from his face. "Go home," she told him. "You do not belong here." The man stared cross-eyed at the crude metal blade for a moment before he got up and limped away towards the village. She looked back towards the manor to see if anyone had noticed, and two pairs of yellow eyes looked up from her hazy shadow. "Your orders, Camilla?" The words dripped with anticipation. She had the vague sense that the shadow demons had been patiently waiting for this the entire time, and the brief exchange had caused them to finally come out to ask if they could participate. Tossing the billhook aside, Ludmilla held out her hand. "Braces. Gauntlets. Spear," she said. After armoring her forearms and hands, Ludmilla grasped the haft of the weapon rising out of her shadow. They were carrying her longbow and 6 quivers stuffed with arrows as well. She wondered where they kept everything. "One of you, follow the man that just left," she ordered. "If he tries to bring anyone back from the village, deal with them in this same spot. If he just returns home, come back to me." A shadow demon flickered away through the hedges and Ludmilla reviewed what she had seen of Campbell's manor. The unexpected absence of all but one servant made things much easier. The majority of the men in the yard had the same feeling to them as the two she had quickly dispatched, only the ones equipped in chainmail probably had any real reason to stand their ground. "Enter the manor first," she said. "The mercenaries you saw when we came in previously, kill all of them in the manor, save for the ones in the hall with Campbell Fassett. Do not alert the men out here until this is completed, if possible. After that, stand guard outside of the room that Campbell is in until I arrive. If you see a servant with green hair wandering around, leave her alone." The second shadow demon remained, even after she finished her instructions. "I'll be waiting here until the other returns," she said. "I'll be fine." It scrutinized her for a moment until it, tooth flickered away. Ludmilla went to stand out of sight of the road after tossing aside the makeshift spears and dragging the fallen man along with her. Waiting in the shadows, she strained her ears, trying to hear anything from the manor above. Several minutes later, a shadow demon appeared before her. "What happened?" she asked. The man returned to his home, it shrugged. "Oh," Ludmilla blinked. She could still not distinguish one from another after several days in their company. Hefting her weapon, she walked up the road to the estate entrance. Not a single person had come looking for the two missing sentries. The men in the yard continued to stand around in twos and threes, chatting amongst themselves in low voices. There was no indication that they were aware of what was going on inside the manor, nor could she see anything through its windows. The group of men at the door remained undisturbed in their vigil. "Remove the mercenaries at the entrance," she instructed. "See what you can do about scaring away all of these men loitering about in the yard as well." Ludmilla peeked around the corner of the gate again to see what the shadow demon would do. The first mercenary's head was abruptly twisted from his shoulders, held aloft in the dark talons which had come out of the shadows of the ceiling above. To their credit, the mercenaries instantly reacted with startled shouts, stabbing upwards at the figure sticking down towards them. The shadow demon ignored the attacks, which simply passed through its translucent, wavering body. If Ludmilla was not mistaken, magically imbued attacks were required for one to even have a chance at damaging a creature with incorporeal properties. Campbell's men truly had no chance. The men scattered around the yard turned curiously to see what the commotion was about. The shadow demon picked out a target amongst them and held the detached head. It struck a tall man solidly in the stomach and he fell to the ground, winded. The head rolled away leaving a thin trail of blood behind it, and the faces of the men around him turned pale as it came to a stop and they realized what it was that had streaked through the air. Their attention went back to the manor entrance as the mercenaries shouted for help, but they were clearly conflicted on what to do and did not approach. The shadow demon flipped back around, drifting to the floor as it wrested away one of the spears that the mercenaries were trying to use against it. The demon turned the weapon against the man to its right and the spear punched through both his shield and himself before he could react. It didn't stop there, though. Even as the first man weakly grasped the bloodied haft with both hands, he was lifted off of the ground as the same weapon was used to impale the leftmost sentry across the way, who offered no more resistance than the first. The final mercenary had seen enough. Throwing his weapon and shield to the ground, he desperately dashed away towards the entrance of the estate. The shadow demon turned to peer after him with a grin, and came forward with a spear upon which the two others still squirmed. With its running, floating, dash start, it launched the weapon into the air and the projectile made a clean arc over the lane before skewering the fleeing mercenary through the back, pinning him on the road halfway to the gate. There was an indescribable sound as the two bodies slid down the haft of the spear to press him into the ground as he writhed in agony. A few moments passed as the bystanders stood frozen at the grisly sequence of events, then the men around the grounds broke as one, fleeing for the gate with rising cries of horror. They did not even look towards where Ludmilla stood, off to the side of the estate entrance in their single-minded flight for survival. After the yard was emptied out, she entered the gate and stopped to look at the grisly totem planted in the road. Though far larger in scale, it was vaguely similar to the territorial markers erected by the demi-human tribes in the wilderness beyond her domain. At some point, the people of Warden's Vale had started to set up their own which, in the end, was far more effective at defining their borders than constantly chasing trespassers around. Neither they nor the neighboring tribes ever used entire bodies, though. The shadow demon circled around its handiwork, floating off to the side to pick up the detached head nearby. It returned to fly up and jam the head onto the base of the spear, then turned to Ludmilla and bowed. "Does it expect applause?" "What, inspired you to do this?" she asked. The first attempt was insufficient, it responded with a broad grin, so a more potent measure was devised. Ludmilla's eyes shifted to the head on the spear, then back to the shadow demon. "I suppose I can't deny its effectiveness," she said, "but I pity whoever has to come and clean this up. There's nothing more for us out here, let's head in." The demon slipped back into her shadow, and Ludmilla stepped over the pools of blood in the entryway to open the door of the manor. Within, there were no signs of any disturbances along the long corridor, save for a fallen mercenary at the door to the hall. The other shadow demon hovered over the corpse. What happened? She asked as she neared. This one came to look outside when the noise outdoors started, it explained. The others barricaded themselves inside afterwards. The rest of the manor? There were few. They are no more. What's left in the hall? The noble. The servant. 7 mercenaries. Nothing seemed to have changed. Well, given that it was not even 20 minutes since the carriage had departed, it wasn't exactly unexpected. Campbell and the woman are to be left unharmed, she said. Deal with the mercenaries and remove the barricade when you are done. The 2 shadow demons waved their arms at one another several times, making signs with their hands. Ludmilla furrowed her brow as she watched their strange behavior. What are you 2 doing? She asked. Jankenpon. What? Competing between ourselves to determine a winner. Does the winner get to go inside, or stay with me? The 2 shadow demons remained silent, and Ludmilla rolled her eyes. I'm not so fragile that the piles of dust here will be the end of me, she said. Both of you, just get in here, we still have much more to do ahead of us. Panicked shouts and hoarse screaming could be heard on the other side of the wall seconds later. Not half a minute had passed before clunking noises issued through the door as various objects were removed from the other side of the entrance. The door swung inwards, and Ludmilla stepped through. With how sudden and violent the shadow demon attack sounded, Ludmilla expected the hall to be painted with gore, but it was mostly undisturbed save for the 7 men that lay unmoving on the floor with blood pooling around them. Some had their throats torn out, while long gashes had been opened across the armor of others. At the head of the hall, Campbell Fassett sat rigid at his table, narrow face as pale as those of the dead men strewn about. The green-haired servant was sitting beside him, steel-grey eyes darting back and forth around the chamber. Ludmilla retraced the steps that Clara's entourage had taken up the center of the hall, stopping to look up at the trembling nobleman. His eyes followed her, but it took several long moments before he found his voice. Who are you? He stammered. You know who I am, Ludmilla replied. No, I've never seen you before. Hysteria rose in his voice. Why have you done this? Why would you do this? Who? Was it my sister? Did she send you to kill me? Assassin? How much did she pay you? I will triple the amount. Ludmilla resisted the urge to look down at her outfit. He had just held his audience with Clara and Campbell claimed to not recognize her. She supposed that it changed nothing, in the end. You may call me Camilla, she said. I have come from the capital. You're the inspector they spoke of, then, he said. But why? They got to you, didn't they? Those self-righteous bitches from the east. What vile lies did they tell you? How could he be so adamant? If they had not spent the past few days collecting all of the various bits of information and records from the county that they could, Ludmilla would have severely doubted her own actions. Her gaze hardened as disgust simmered within her. She was not here to argue. The placid tone of her voice surprised even herself as it carried throughout the hall. Count Campbell Fassett, she said. Addressed by his title, he straightened his posture somewhat. Yes? His voice was tinged with hope. You are called to account for the deeds of your house, she said. For its tenure as a territory of the Sorceress Kingdom. His blue eyes were adrift in confusion and his thin lips turned to frown. What? It's only been 2 months. Not even that. What could I possibly be? You have exchanged your household to finance this company of mercenaries, she cut through his protests. No. I released them from my service. You have throttled distribution of food and supplies, purposely hoarding the necessities of life to press the people of your domain into your service through extortion. I have done no such thing. You have defied the development directives outlined by the royal court by further driving your domain into destitution with this familial dispute. The streets and storefronts are cleaned and repaired, made presentable, as ordered. Your deterrents against crime are insufficient, effectively facilitating it through a system of periodic, affordable fines for personal gain. I am adhering to the law. I have the right to exercise justice within my own domain in the way that I see fit. You send your men into Riesties to steal crops of Lera, and allow smugglers to deliver it to neighboring nations. What? That's not me, that's... You shelter bands of mercenaries in the hills and caves throughout this county, allowing them to operate from within your borders, in exchange for favors against your opponents. No, no. That's not me. That's Jacqueline. Ludmilla slammed the base of her spear against the wooden floor. The harsh sound echoed over the chamber several times before fading into deathly silence. Count Facet, you claim to be Count Facet, do you not? Of course, I am. The head of House Facet, Ludmilla finished his sentence for him. It is your family, your household, your land, your towns, villages and hamlets, your people. Everything that happens in your domain is your responsibility. She stepped forward, the sound of her boots bouncing off the chamber walls. This is the Sorceress Kingdom now. Do you know what it means to be a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom, Count Facet? His mouth worked silently as he followed her slow advance. You have been granted your lands to administer in good faith, Ludmilla told him, by the grace of your liege. But that is the same. Count Facet protested, everything is the same. Our positions are the same as in Riestais. Our laws are the same as Riestais. We nobles have rights and protections, provided by the laws that have been adopted by the Sorcerer King himself. Indeed, Ludmilla replied, but this is Riestais no longer, Count Facet. There is no sovereign on his faraway throne, no place that lies beyond his reach. You cannot shield yourself with posturing and pretense. Twisted, half-hearted measures are as good as none. Your lies will not avail you and you cannot hide what you have done. Your wealth will buy no one, there is no fear of disapproval and your resistance means nothing. Ludmilla placed a foot on the steps to the dais. Above all else, you have the duty to uphold the dictates of His Majesty's order, she continued. As a noble, you have obligations to fulfill and laws to enforce according to his will. Duty is why your authority exists. Duty is what binds the nobility, Count Facet, so spare me your talk of rights. To be certain, as long as you remain faithful in performing your duties, you may benefit from what rights, protections and immunities your liege and his laws have afforded you, but you have decidedly not done anything of the sort. You have not simply failed in your duty, Count Facet, you have defied it, and in defying your duty as his vassal, you have defied His Majesty's will. Standing over Campbell Facet, Ludmilla looked down at his cowering form. The pale mask reflected in his terror-filled eyes. Now tell me, Count Facet, she asked him quietly, what does that make you? Ludmilla awaited an answer to her question, another stubborn rebuttal or excuse, but Count Facet only continued to fearfully look up at her. She stepped forward, reaching out to pull him up from his chair. With a shriek, the skinny man fell off of his seat as he frantically pulled away from her grasp. He scrambled backwards over the floor. Away, he cried, save me. The green-haired servant leapt into action, tackling Ludmilla in the waist. They stumbled together, away from the table, and Ludmilla saw what she had intended to check on ever since she saw her. The servant's long, green hair flew wildly as she struggled to push Ludmilla back, revealing a pair of long, pointed ears. There was little chance she could be anyone else. She silently instructed the shadow demons quietly creeping towards them to stand down. Mrs. Lynham, she said calmly. Please let go. If she recognized the name, she showed no sign of it and continued to do what she could to carry out Count Facet's frantic orders. Ludmilla gave her a hard shove, and the elf stumbled away to fall back onto the floor near the table. Ludmilla's gaze locked onto Count Facet, who had put his back against the wall. She stepped towards him. Away! He called out desperately again. Away pulled herself to her feet, snatching a knife from among the utensils on the table. She dashed forward again, holding the small blade out in Ludmilla's direction. Ludmilla brought the haft of her spear down over the elf's bare wrist, and Alway gasped in pain. The knife fell to the floor and clattered away, but Alway continued forward to grab at Ludmilla again. Struggling to free herself again, Ludmilla couldn't understand why a slave would fight so desperately for her master, for a house which had, by all appearances, mistreated her for generations. Beyond them, Count Facet finally found his feet and disappeared into the servants' entrance of the hall. Ludmilla finally worked Alway off of her and shoved the elf away once more. She nearly tripped when she moved forward, only to have the elf wrap her arms around one of her legs. Follow him, Ludmilla ordered, he is still to be left unharmed. A shadow demon flickered away as Ludmilla untangled herself from Always' continued attempts to impede her. When she nearly made it to the entry that Count Facet had escaped out of, she stopped at the sound of someone running past the other side of the wall. Ludmilla dashed back up the hall to leave out of the main entrance. Stepping out, she was barely able to brace herself before the fleeing Count collided headfirst into her. She was jarred backwards and the man fell back over onto the floor of the corridor so hard. He rolled over onto his side with a groan. Ow! Ow! Stop! It hurts. I yield. I yield. Alway appeared to the sight of her master being stepped on repeatedly. Master! She threw herself bodily over Count Facet with a cry. The man peeked over Alway's thin shoulder, looking up at Ludmilla with a fearful, victimized expression. Why would you do that? No reason. She brushed aside her irritation as she looked down at the two. Count Facet continued his whimpering under her glare. Should she just order the shadow demons to carry them off? Ludmilla eyed the growing bruise on Alway's wrist. She wanted to avoid causing her any distress, but she just kept coming to the young nobleman's defense with no regard to her own safety. Get up, Count Facet, Ludmilla told the nobleman cowering on the floor. We're leaving. Leaving? Where? Why? Ludmilla furrowed her brow behind her mask. You are being brought away to answer for the charges that have been leveled against you, Ludmilla replied. Or have you somehow forgotten what just transpired mere minutes ago? Count Facet looked up to her as if she were insane, and his plaintive voice rose in protest. This is madness, he said. I have done nothing wrong. You have provided no evidence for your accusations, only arriving to viciously attack me in my own manner. This unjustified assault of yours runs afoul of the crown laws. No one may do such a thing, not even the king himself. The evidence for your violations has already been gathered, Ludmilla said. Did you really expect someone to come ask for your permission to perform an investigation? Of course. Count Facet answered, it would only be proper. The fact that this evidence has been collected independently already makes it highly suspect. You would have received my full cooperation if you had only asked for proof related to your task here. I have no wrongdoings to hide, after all. Despite his recent disgraceful display, Count Facet seemed to have gathered enough of his wits to resume his act once again. Or was it an act? His lying on the floor while doing so made it all the more ludicrous. At this point, she could not tell whether he was still trying to employ the letter of the law as a shield or just outright delusional. You have two choices available, Count Facet, Ludmilla said flatly. Either you walk away with us, or we drag you away with us. To both, he spat, I refuse. You have no rig. Let's go, she said. Do not harm the elf. Ludmilla turned around and walked back down the corridor to the entrance. A shadow demon rose to the nobleman's horrified screams and grasped one of his ankles. He thrashed and cried as he slid off towards the entrance of the manor with Alway following after him, her face marred with worry while she wrung her hands. The struggle ceased momentarily as he was dragged straight over the dead mercenary in the hall, his fine jacket painting a crimson streak all the way to the door. The fading light of the evening skies greeted them outdoors in wind-swept silence. Count Facet ended his struggling entirely and his face grew pale as he was dragged by the headless corpse outside the door. He grew paler still as they passed the grim totem planted in the middle of the manor lane. What kind of monster are you? His voice trembled. You are the monster here, Ludmilla wanted to reply, but she did not deign him with an answer. They stopped outside the entrance of the village below the manor where she scanned the buildings and lanes. It had no illumination beyond the torch in the square and that of a few open windows. Two militia sentries stood in the square. Beyond that everyone seemed to have retreated into their homes. Ludmilla exchanged her spear for her longbow, along with two quivers of arrows which she clipped to her belt. Reveal yourself plainly, she instructed the shadow demons. Let's keep going. The two demons floated over the road, their winged forms clearly visible to any who looked in their direction. Several sets of shutters slammed shut. As they approached the square, Count Facet found his voice again. You two there. He called out to the militia sentries, help me. The two men turned their heads towards the sound of his voice, readying their weapons cautiously. Their stances faltered when they saw what came into the torchlight, and they stumbled backwards in panicked retreat. What are you doing? Count Facet yelled, I am your lord. I order you to attack. The men only continued to back away as he was dragged by. Hysterical breathing rose from behind Ludmilla. "Damn it!" Count Facet's shrill voice drifted over the village square. "Fulfill your duty to your liege. Kill these insolent wretches." His continued cries as they turned onto the highway which ran along the length of the village drew curious onlookers. Wide eyes peeked through the cracks in doors and shutters at the sight. Count Facet looked left and right at all of the silent bystanders in their homes. "You," he shouted, "peasants. Come out here and deal with these criminals." The villagers only stared back at him. "You fools. I am your lord. How dare you defy me?" Count Facet continued shouting, cursing and threatening as he was dragged all the way through to the end of the village. He saw the last few buildings go by and cried out into the twilight. "Please, please. Save me, someone, please." He wailed, "I don't want this. This isn't right. I'll give you anything, everything. Oh gods, please save me from these monsters." His racking sobs filled the air as they made their way north. Ludmilla stopped when they were well away from the village. "You can stop dragging him now," Ludmilla said to the shadow demon. "Away, help Count Facet to his feet." The nobleman's leather boot thumped as his ankle was released to drop to the cobblestones, and Ludmilla watched as Alway gently helped him to his feet. The elf spoke in soft and soothing tones to him as she did so, and Ludmilla wondered once again how she could show such care for a family that had shown her such cruelty. Looking at Campbell Facet's haggard face, she decided that the fight had gone out of him entirely, but she believed that after he had been thoroughly shaken in his manner as well. At the least, he probably wouldn't want to be dragged all the way to the encampment in the north. Looking over her shoulder after they resumed walking, she saw them shuffling forward with no signs of resistance. When they were halfway to the encampment on the ridge, Ludmilla projected her voice. "Clara? I am about halfway back." A substantial amount of her was sapped away, and she wobbled on her feet. "I guess I will not be trying it again from that distance anytime soon." After several minutes with no reply, Ludmilla wondered if she had accidentally knocked out her friend with an attempt to respond. After closing half again the distance, she tried again to a more manageable drain akin to her test in Warden's Vale. Once again she received no response. She could make details out of the ring of wagons, tents and barricades and nothing seemed to be amiss, so she decided there was some unknown aspect of the ability that prevented Clara's reply, if she had even heard her in the first place. Night had fully fallen by the time they arrived back at the camp. The footmen maintained bored expressions as their vigil dragged on through the evening. The gaze of one stopped over them, and she saw him turn to call into the camp. Clara appeared with 2 escorts shortly after, but she was held back by the footman along the barricade when she attempted to run out and meet her on the way. "Ludmilla?" Clara called out to her from the perimeter. "Oh, I can hear you now. I heard you twice before, but my replies did not seem to work. I called and called in the direction of your voice until I got dizzy and had to sit down. Sorry about that. I guess there are still things we need to figure out." Their silent dialogue tapered off as Ludmilla walked up to the barricade. "How are we doing here?" she asked. Clara looked to one of the footmen that had accompanied her, and he straightened fully before reporting. "We're too far to really make any real details out up north, Lady Camilla," he said. "We've seen none of the armed men that were mentioned, nor any other people coming up the road at all. There are no visible changes over the town, just seems like any other night from our end, aside from the smoke from the manor fire. Would it have been better to send a few men to check?" "No," Ludmilla shook her head, "you've done well. Ensuring the camp remains secure is our priority." "Lady Camilla." Campbell's voice came from the side. "There is no house Camilla, who are you?" Ludmilla removed the mask, and Campbell gasped. You're Corlin's lady-in-waiting." Clara looked over Ludmilla's outfit. Then she looked again. "Really?" she said incredulously. "Really," said Ludmilla. "But I didn't even try to hide anything," Ludmilla shrugged as she put the mask away. "Well, aside from wearing this, do we have suitable accommodations prepared for Count Facet?" "For the both of them," Clara replied, "if Jacqueline survived somehow. What about the other nobles supporting him?" "He was the only one in the manor and I didn't bother asking along the way here. You can try getting that out of him while I check to see if there's anything left of Jacqueline." Clara turned to look at Count Facet with a neutral expression. I see, she said. Well, Count Facet, I can't say that it's a pleasure to see you again, but my footman will escort you to your tent. What about this servant? She's with me, Ludmilla replied. Ludmilla's grip tightened on Alway's arm as Clara led the young nobleman away. The elf still tried to pull away to follow him. He is your master no longer, Mrs. Lynham, she told her firmly. She was at a loss as to how to address her strange behavior. Alway continued to struggle until her breath grew short. As she watched Count Facet disappear behind the line of tents, Ludmilla instructed the shadow demons to check on Jacqueline's manor and deal with any assailants they might find in the vicinity. Alway was still trying to get away when she finished issuing her orders. Come, Mrs. Lynham, she urged her, Willuvian and Liluvian have been searching for you. At the sound of their names, she calmed somewhat and allowed herself to be led away. The tent where Lynham's sisters saw to their work was brightly lit, and both of Ludmilla's chambermaids were awake and sifting through the pile of unsorted information that remained. A small folding table, upon which lay a map of the county under a small notebook and several sheets of paper, was set up in the center. Gathered around it with them were the children from the town. They turned their heads towards the entrance in unison as Ludmilla pulled aside the flap. Welcome back, my lady, Liluvian came forward to greet her. We're just As she rose from her curtsy, Liluvian glanced over to the figure that was pulled into the tent alongside Ludmilla and her breath caught in her throat. Liluvian took one step forward, then another. All at once, she fell to her knees, reaching out to grasp the hem of Ludmilla's skirt. Thank you, my lady. Tears started falling to the ground as she bent forward to press her face into her dress. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Liluvian continued to pour out her gratitude between heartfelt sobs, and Willuvian had fallen beside her to do the same. The four children watched quietly from the table. Are you trying to get me going as well? Ludmilla's voice nearly broke under the flood of their emotions as she stepped away, bringing Alway forward to stand in her place. I was able to bring her with me, Ludmilla said, but I don't know how to handle this. She keeps trying to return to Count Facet, and she has attacked me multiple times on his orders. Is it really safe to leave her with you like this? We will keep our mother close, my lady, Liluvian replied after another shuddering sob. We've been there before. But you saved me and my sister, my lady, and now our mother as well. Our family will serve your house forever, Lady Zaradnik. Ludmilla was unsure how to respond. Did they just cast off centuries of bondage, only to immediately turn around to offer an eternity of service? Your family may serve for as long as they desire, but it is your choice. You are slaves no longer. Her lips turned up in a light smirk. What I said when you entered my service remains unchanged. Slavery is illegal in the Sorceress Kingdom. Ludmilla turned away from the Lynham sisters, who were weeping and embracing their mother, leaving the tent before her own tears could escape. She turned away from the interior of the encampment to wipe her eyes clear before heading towards the pavilion. It turned out that the three other noble women were instead gathered around the main campfire, gazes cast across the distance towards the town. There was a footman standing behind Count Facet's shoulder, and the nobleman slouched despondently on a log. Though he was supposed to have been shown his accommodations, he had taken no effort to correct his haggard appearance. On another side of the fire, Clara, Leanne and Florine looked in her direction as she entered into the light. Anything? Ludmilla asked. Count Facet jumped up at her voice with a shout. The footman immediately forced him back down onto his seat. Perhaps you'll have better luck scaring some answers out of him, Clara smiled slightly. We've just started, and everything so far is just the same brazen denials and evasive posturing. Clara glanced to the nobleman seated near the fire before taking Ludmilla aside. His clothing was covered in mud and blood, Clara whispered. Just what in the world did you do? Leanne and Florine think that you had him tortured. Oh, he refused to come with me, Ludmilla replied, so I had him dragged out. There were a bunch of corpses along the way, that is where the blood is from. Her friend frowned at her casual explanation. Parts of his jacket were torn, Clara continued. One of his sleeves and half of his collar were missing completely. Lynham, the elf servant that came with us, tried to stop him from being dragged off a few times, but only came away with pieces of his outfit. Why are there heel marks all over him? Clara peered at her. No reason. Huh? Well, I suppose you should join us, Clara said. I simply cannot believe how he can just revert to the same behavior after being subjected to all of that. Is this sort of shameless conduct something common in the West? You know that I am probably the last person that would have the answer to that, Ludmilla replied, but there will be time for him later. I am going to head out and check on Jacques. She stopped and turned her head as a figure appeared at her side. Ludmilla's eyes grew wide in recognition. She quickly placed her longbow on the ground and lowered her head in a deep curtsy. Lady Sheltier, she greeted her liege. From beside her Clara gasped in recognition and she, too, followed suit. Leanne and Florine were not long after, and soon every servant within the perimeter had ceased what they were doing to lower themselves in deference to Lady Sheltier Bloodfallen. Out of the corner of her vision, Ludmilla watched Campbell Fassett look around himself in half a stupor before going to one knee. The campfire crackled in the silence as Lady Sheltier swept her gaze over the camp. She turned towards the town and inhaled deeply. It appears that you've started the fun without me, her voice chimed lightly. My lady. Ludmilla was unsure of what she spoke of. The scent of blood is thick on the wind, she replied. Unless mass bloodletting is some sort of recreational activity around here, many have died violently this evening, though I suppose you have just returned from the south. My lady is well informed. Ludmilla glanced up at her liege. Well, I have been keeping an eye on you this entire time, Lady Sheltier smiled mysteriously. You may all rise. Glancing around them, Ludmilla wondered how they were being watched. Now that she was aware of Lady Sheltier's surveillance, she noticed several small black bats flittering around in the night. More could be seen in the shadows of the carriages and trees, a few with glowing red eyes that gleamed in her direction. Bats were a common sight everywhere in the duchy. It seemed a dozen or more of Lady Sheltier's household had infiltrated themselves into the local population. Thank you for your kind concern, my lady, Ludmilla nodded her head. If the scent of blood on the wind, it should be due to Campbell's attack on Jacqueline's manor. I'm unsure of her fate, but the two shadow demons I sent to investigate might be able to find and secure her if she has survived. There should be a third, yes? Lady Sheltier said, my escorts have already secured this camp. Send it with the others to find out. At once, my lady. Ludmilla turned away to look around the camp. Spotting the patrolling shadow demon, she issued new instructions. I'm innocent, I swear it. A pleading voice sounded over the gathering as they turned to walk back over to the campfire. The young nobleman had risen from his kneeling position, stumbling forward Lady Sheltier with a desperate look. I never had a chance to prove myself, he begged. This isn't fair. So noisy, Lady Sheltier said as her crimson eyes flared. Campbell Fassett's wide-eyed expression faded and transformed into one of dull-eyed adulation. A silly smile appeared on his sallow face. Return to your seat, Lady Sheltier said. Do not speak unless you have my leave to do so. The nobleman quietly returned to his log and sat back down. Much better, Lady Sheltier said without looking in his direction. Now then, what mischief has this fellow been up to? Her carefree tone resulted in a few seconds of silence before Clara realized that she should answer. Oh, She turned her head. Wagner, our report should be on the table in the pavilion, should it not? Yes, Lady Corlin. Leanne nodded. I'll retrieve it immediately. While she was away, the shadow demon returned. Jacqueline Fassett is no more, it reported. We have slain her slayers. Charmed as he was, Campbell Fassett did not even react to the news that his sister had perished. Going by what remained to guard Campbell's manor, Ludmilla said, there should have been nearly an entire mercenary company. Did you get them all? Several dozen have fled into the surrounding countryside, the shadow demon said. We are currently pursuing them. I see, she frowned. Head back out to help finish the work there then. Lady Sheltier shifted slightly beside Ludmilla. I must apologize, my lady. Ludmilla turned to lower her head. I have failed to secure the other party in this dispute. Leanne returned from the pavilion, offering the report that had been compiled from what they had discovered over the past few days. Ludmilla thought she saw a dismayed look briefly cross over Lady Sheltier's face. It was no surprise, the binder must have been more than 10 centimeters thick. We'll discuss that at length later, her liege said as she reached out to take the report. Lady Shaltia frowned warily at the thick binder, testing its weight as if she suspected it was some sort of illusion. Even with her own participation in the investigation, Ludmilla was still shocked that such a damning record could be put together for a single noble house in such a short time. "There is a summary for this, I hope," Lady Shaltia said. "Yes, my lady," replied Clara. "An index has been included for the convenience of the royal court." Lady Shaltia opened the cover and frowned down at the contents, flipping through the pages. "This index is 20 pages long," she said. They waited expectantly in the following silence, and Lady Shaltia sighed. "All right then." She turned to Count Fassett, "Count Campbell Fassett. You will answer my questions truthfully. A simple yes or no will suffice where appropriate." The young nobleman did not lose his besotted expression as he looked up in response. "Yes, mistress," he said. "It would be my pleasure." Lady Shaltia cleared her throat before speaking, frowning down at the open binder held in front of her. "Are you complicit in the underground slave markets of this county, and in the trafficking of slaves to other territories and the nations beyond?" "Yes, mistress," he said happily, "I am." His response was immediate, and a low murmur rose from the surroundings. "Does House Fassett coordinate the illegal cultivation and harvest of Lara crops across the border, for refinement into Lara powder to export from your domain?" "Yes, mistress, we do." "Has House Fassett effectively licensed criminal groups by employing a schedule of affordable fines and light punishments that are ineffective at deterrence?" "Yes, mistress, we have." "Do you use the proceeds from this scheme to both enrich yourselves and subsidize groups of brigands posing as mercenaries throughout your territory, to be employed against your enemies both within your domain and beyond?" "Yes, mistress." For many minutes Lady Shaltia went down the long list of subjects outlined in the index of the report, with Count Fassett confirming the truth to each. The air had been abuzz when the questioning had started, but, by the time she finished, only the sounds of the campfire and rustle of the wind through the grass could be heard. "If I may, my lady," Ludmilla said, "I would like to ask one more question of him." Lady Shaltia nodded regally, and Ludmilla turned to address Count Fassett. After reconsolidating the county court following the resolution of the succession dispute, she asked, "Did you intend on continuing this behavior, regardless of whether it was the will of your liege?" Count Fassett furrowed his brow at her question, and looked at Lady Shaltia. "Is this true?" Lady Shaltia prompted. "Yes, mistress," he grinned, "it is true. The power and wealth of my lord father is now mine to use as I see fit, and with it I will build a legacy to surpass all others." Lady Shaltia snapped the binder shut in her hand, and the besotted smile fell off of Count Fassett's face. He blinked several times before a low moan of despair rose from him. He bent forward in his seat, cradling his head in his hands. "See?" Lady Shaltia turned to look up at Ludmilla with a brilliant smile. "I told you it was a silly law. It should be changed, yes?" "I see the benefits to its use," Ludmilla replied evenly, "but it's still dangerous if misused. If its implementation were up to me, at best it would be an amendment to the laws that would allow the licensing of officers that can be trusted to wield it appropriately for investigative purposes." "So you propose that an amendment be made," Lady Shaltia mused, "allowing only trusted servants the use of domination magic on the citizens? I'll be sure to let Albedo know that the House of Lords might be open to supporting this measure. She'll be thrilled that these powers would remain the sole purview of the courts. It's good that you've come around on this matter." Lady Shaltia's gaze rested on each of the noble women's faces around the campfire for several moments before speaking again. "Now that all has been laid bare," she said, "I suppose your work is done here. There are still a few weeks until the coming events surrounding our new relationship with the Empire, so I'm certain you'd like to return to your territories to ensure that your preparations are sufficient. Ready yourselves to leave as soon as possible. Except for Lady Zaradnik, she and I still have much to do." "We do, my lady," Ludmilla said. "Why, of course," Lady Shaltia replied. "We will need to discuss your actions, but, in the end, the results have not changed. After the royal court is through with them, Count Fassett, as well as House Fassett's closest lackeys, have a permanent reservation awaiting their pleasure. It's a shame that we couldn't make this a family trip, but I suppose we can't make everyone happy all the time." The royal court. Clara swallowed. What will the royal court do? Clara asked. Everything we've done here, we did it not only because we thought it was the best course of action, but also because the House of Lords fears the repercussions of House Facet's deviancy. Is everything we've done here enough to convince the royal court that the remaining members of the nobility can be trusted to continue their administrative duties? Or has all of our effort been for naught? On the contrary, Lady Shiltier said, I believe much has been gained here. You have compiled a substantial amount of knowledge that others unfamiliar with these silly human games will learn so that they may apply themselves more effectively in His Majesty's service. If the servants of the Sorcerer King can learn lessons from this knowledge that will prepare them for similar problems in the future, then rather than fearing punishment, should it not a reward be in order for those that have worked to deliver this result? Then the laws? Clara seemed hesitant to ask. The laws are always subject to change, Lady Shiltier said, or change will have them eventually become obsolete and useless. However, I highly doubt any of your immediate fears will come to pass after your efforts here. After you ensure that this report is suitable for presentation, the three of you should submit it personally to the royal court. The Prime Minister will surely be delighted to see such a weighty article. As I said before, His Majesty's servants will benefit from this knowledge, and Albedo will surely incorporate it in the future to better equip the administration for their tasks. Clara's eyes went to Ludmilla. Lady Shiltier did not miss her meaning. You need not worry about Lady Zaradnik, she said. She is my vassal, my responsibility. There are other lessons she must learn before we leave, though I suppose that you ladies should at least learn this next one as well. Lady Shiltier turned to walk towards the overlook. The four noblewomen exchanged glances before following. The servants dispersed to break camp and prepare for the return trip to the capital. You seem to believe that securing Jacqueline Facet was a condition for success. Lady Shiltier turned to face them again as she spoke to Ludmilla. Did you believe that by capturing both parties in this dispute, an appropriate resolution would be attained? Yes, my lady, Ludmilla replied. In addition to rounding up their respective courts and key members of their leadership in other areas. I see, she said. Then as your liege, I have the responsibility to correct this misconception. Looking at each noblewoman in turn, Lady Shiltier spoke after she appeared satisfied that they were giving her their complete attention. The will of Einsulgan is paramount, she said, not only in the Sorcerer's Kingdom, but in every place where His Majesty's servants may find themselves. It matters not where that may be. It is our duty as servants of His Majesty to see the realization of His will to the utmost of our capabilities. As nobles, you are responsible for administering many and, through your leadership, your territories will grow and flourish should you rule wisely and well. Yet, by this same token, you appear to believe that everything can be solved by simply removing the head of every problem you come across. The report you have written suggests that every facet of civilian life here has been infected with the corruption that House Facet has long harbored in its domain. In the index alone, there were mentions of shopkeepers and militia, farmers and woodsmen, all complicit in these activities that go against His Majesty's desires. My lady, Ludmilla asked, do you mean to say that making an example out of their leadership is not enough to change the ways of the people? Change their ways? Lady Shiltier said, you misunderstand me. Even after being recipients of His Majesty's grace, they have opposed His Majesty's will, thus they must answer for their defiance. But it's not their fault. Clara protested, it is a path set before them through generations of mismanagement by House Facet. If they had better leaders, if they had real opportunities, the future of the Sorcerer's Kingdom offers so much. Did His Majesty not offer this future to all of his subjects? Indeed, Lady Shiltier said, and those that would bring harm to what is his shall be granted no quarter. I do not care for their reasons, only that they did, and what it means. You are all nobles, all eminently capable, if what I have heard is to be believed, so it should not be so hard to understand. Now tell me, in regard to His Majesty's will, how many have crossed the line in the town you see before us? Clara fell silent and she struggled to keep a frown from forming on her lips. She visibly swallowed, and a tear trickled down her cheek. All of them, Leanne said. Leanne, Florian cried. All of them, Leanne repeated herself firmly. Every field that they ploughed, every tree that they felled, every coin that they turned, all of it ultimately went to feed the corrupt beast that House Facet grew into. But the children. Florian's voice trailed off. Leanne's eyes flashed angrily at her mention. "Have you seen children like that before, Florian?" she asked. "In your own domain? In mine? You have seen how eager they are. They are like a pack of bloodthirsty hounds, trained by their handler to sniff out and steal whatever they can find that seems useful. They would even kill if we offered them but a single gold coin. They already place a price on that which is not their own to take. How many more of them are there in that town? Viciously competing with one another to get by, and for what? They strive to become the harlots, thugs and brigands that serve the dregs of this county, or the next handler that raises the next generation that will grow up to be just like them." Florian glared furiously at her friend. It was the first time Ludmilla had seen them at such odds. Leanne's expression softened somewhat, her voice turning conciliatory. "We cannot be children anymore, Florian, nor can we answer as children. We cannot even answer according to our personal preferences. Lady Shiltir asked us as nobles. As nobles, we cannot fix every problem, we cannot right every wrong. We cannot reach out and save every man, woman and child on a whim. We cannot mend every wound and remove every scar. We cannot go into the past and reverse everything that has been done, and we cannot allow what has taken root here to spread. Whether our subjects bless us or curse us, it is our duty to lead and administer our territories in the best ways that we know. The decisions that we make, the paths that we take, determine the future for our people. When House Facet chose to take this cursed path, they damned all of their people as well." Leanne's voice started to break as she finished speaking, and she drew a handkerchief out of a pocket to dry her eyes. Lady Shiltir's voice rose from in front of them again. "You should understand that what is being done is not simply because it is easy or convenient," she told them. "His Majesty's will applies to all of his subjects, from the meanest dwellings in the furthest lands, to the highest hall of the Sorceress Kingdom. Race and creed, friends and family, these bonds exist by the grace of Ainzul Gaon. Even we who stand closest to His Majesty are not above the will of the Supreme One. If it was known that the Guardian Overseer herself sought to undermine Lord Ainz's will, the rest of us would set upon her without hesitation and render her into nothingness. Only the disgraceful memory of her treason would remain." Lady Shiltir's bright crimson gaze went to each noblewoman, as if she could fix her words in their minds. After a long moment, she turned around and walked to the edge of the cliff. The mournful wind pulled at the silken frills of her black ballroom gown, as if pleading with her to stay her hand. As above, her declaration resounded through the air, so below. Raising her slight arm, Lady Shiltir stretched a pale palm towards the jeweled canopy of the night. Triplet widen magic, storm of vengeance. Tall clouds blotted out the sky over Facet Town, roiling ever wider until they loomed over the entire settlement. As soon as their expansion ceased, the landscape turned brighter than day as massive flashes of lightning illuminated the sky. Several heartbeats later, a tremendous peal of thunder rolled over the ridge. Horses screamed and panicked in its wake, as did the men and women working to break camp. The noble women did not act to calm their servants, however. The storm had just begun its onslaught. A sickly green rain began to fall upon the town and, after its buildings were completely inundated with the deluge, rooftops sloughed off like melting wax as the liquid pooled in the streets. Bolts of lightning struck the tallest, most resilient buildings, shattering stone and setting wooden frames alight. As the thunder continued to roll over them, Ludmilla saw tiny flecks of white falling from the clouds, reminiscent of a winter flurry. One of them struck a larger building, collapsing an entire wall. To see them from this distance, they must have been hailstones the size of wagons. Before their eyes, the entire town was being pounded into rubble. The smoldering manor overlooking the town finally collapsed, debris sliding down the hill and smashing into the remains of the broken buildings below. In just a single minute since the spell was cast, the storm subsided and the clouds vanished as if they had never been. Laid below the women standing on the overlook was a steaming lake, within it, the remains of the town, burning even as the rubble slowly receded beneath the surface. Lady Shiltir turned back to address them once again. "This lesson is now concluded," she said to the row of ashen faces. "Return to your homes. Lady Zaradnik, retrieve your equipment, the rest of Facet County awaits us."